Hello, my name is Calvin Liang, and today I'll be talking about our paper titled Embracing Four Tensions in HCI Research with Marginalized People, done in collaboration with my co-advisors Sean Munson and Julie Kientz, published in Tokai 2021. So I'd initially come into this project through years of witnessing how HCI and marginalization come together. Upon reflection, my advisors and I generated a lot of questions, as you might expect from a first-year PhD student, like, can an able-bodied researcher study people with disabilities? Can anyone from a non-marginalized population do research on marginalized people? And how can we know if we are making the right decision versus a good or a well-intentioned one? Through these questions, we settled on an exploratory study into how marginalization and HCI intersect. And to ground this conversation, when we are talking about marginalization, we are referring to how a person experiences the world around them based on their identities and how others perceive them. We draw from the axes of oppression in our understanding that for those who experience marginalization, there are different contexts in which they are marginalized and/or privileged, and their experiences can change over the course of a lifetime, a year, or even a day. Also, when thinking about marginalization, we would be remiss not to identify the structural powers that do the actual marginalizing. The oppression that we see in the world is not a naturally occurring thing, but an active operation that society and sometimes HCI research perpetuates. We drew from several fields outside of HCI to inform our research, such as disability studies and systems of power, and we set out to better understand current HCI researchers' approaches to doing work with marginalized people, and so this project was created. Our guiding research question asks, how do HCI researchers engage in and reflect on work that involves marginalized people? This can be further broken down into three sub-questions around specific interactions. How do HCI researchers see their research affecting participants, and how do they reflect on and adjust their practices as a result? How do HCI researchers engage in and reflect on research with marginalized people as it affects researchers? And how do the norms of the field of HCI affect marginalized people as researchers, and further, those researchers' interactions with participants? This was a qualitative study where participants had the choice between taking an online survey, doing a semi-structured interview, or both. We ended up with 24 participants total, and we recruited broadly, asking for self-identified HCI researchers who had worked with marginalized people, which has its own limitations. An important thing to note is that a majority of the voices represented in this study are based in the United States, which definitely skews the data and our analysis. We hope that readers keep that in mind when interpreting our work. We used a reflexive thematic analysis to analyze our data, meaning we constructed themes as we encountered the data until we reached saturation. We also went through a rigorous member checking process where we brought our analysis to participants to see if their data were represented accurately. For each interaction, we present findings as two groups. First, the resulting harms of each interaction, and second, things that our participants did to mitigate such harms, though participants did not provide feedback on every harm we found. Okay, no need for a drum roll or anything, but the four tensions we constructed through our findings are exploitation, membership, disclosure, and allyship. Each tension is complicated, they overlap with each other, and honestly, we'll never fully resolve them. And yet, they are still worth pursuing. And let me show you why. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to provide a quick overview of all four, and so I invite you to check out the full paper for more. So a prevailing theme in this tension is that exploitation is inherent to the research process. Participants in our studies talked about exploitation on two broader levels: extracting experiences from participants and tokenizing the identities of fellow researchers. At the researcher level, it is unethical to involve researchers solely for their marginalized experiences. However, some marginalized researchers spoke of being left with no other choice but to be tokenized to ensure that work is done with care, seen through P8's quote here. Under our current paradigm of research with marginalized people, we rely too heavily on representation at the expense of increased labor for researchers with marginalized backgrounds. But even still, there are ways to mitigate harms for participants and researchers alike. We talk about specific things that researchers we spoke to do to mitigate exploitation, but there are also really great resources out there in the literature. One way we might think about preventing exploitation is limiting who can do research based on identity, but we demonstrate why this is not good, which leads us to tension of membership, which talks about how gatekeeping research based on the identity of an author actually ends up harming marginalized people. It unpacks how, yes, membership is very helpful, but it also does not mean that being a member grants a person omniscience or all-knowing power and authority over that entire group. For example, a queer person is capable of doing unethical queer research, and they cannot speak on behalf of all queer people. At the same time, we absolutely cannot use this as an excuse to invalidate marginalized people's experiences. And so rather than using a researcher's identity as the metric for the appropriateness and validity of their work, can we evaluate what considerations the researcher made throughout their research process, in addition to remaining attentive to the author's positionality in the study context? Membership-based judgments also requires knowing people's identities, but it is harmful to require people to out themselves. This brings us to tension of disclosure. Here, we talk about how reflexive and positionality statements in an ideal sense are good practice, but creating a norm around including them is actually harmful to marginalized researchers. In our interviews, we actually asked specifically about reflexive and positionality statements, which don't necessarily equate to identity-based disclosures, but everyone brought up experiences with them. We can't make marginalized researchers choose between having their work appear as legitimate and possibly be discriminated against for disclosing. To support people making a decision to disclose or not, and for reviewers who might want some more information, we put together a table of questions to consider. For researchers, think about your reasons and if anyone is pressuring you to disclose. Are there mechanisms in place that would allow you to reverse your decision? For reviewers, how might the authors be harmed through such a request? Is there other information that could address these needs? And finally, allyship examines how not all research that claims to be allyship is actually allyship. And yet I believe that all research that involves marginalized people should be done through an allyship-oriented lens. Here we talk about how research should avoid prioritizing a researcher's agenda of the agendas of the participants. This tension also brings together lessons, dilemmas, and questions from the previous three tensions, building towards an allyship-oriented approach to research with marginalized people in HCI. Here, it is about the journey, not the destination. From what we've heard, there are intense pressures that individuals face that are a direct result from a system that tells us that it is our individual responsibility to fix the world and the systems we live in. We are told that if we publish one more paper, we'll get closer to tenure and then we'll finally be able to do some good. But what if we remove that pressure? What if we called out the systems of oppression that are working against us and are informing how we navigate our work? How can we be less focused on the destination and more attuned to how we are getting there? I also really want to point people to several resources that were incredibly helpful in shaping my understanding of all four of these tensions. All of these highlight different definitions, characteristics, and issues of allyship, and critiques, very important. So we have three main limitations that I hope you take with you when interpreting these tensions. First, we ourselves are subjects of our own critique. The themes of extraction were very front of mind for me as I interviewed and analyzed data. Another glaring and valid critique of this paper is that it is very Western and US-centric, despite our best efforts to hear from as many people as possible. Next, where we look across marginalization in the macro, we overlook specific instances of injustice. Finally, while we maintain that each of the tensions that we have identified affects researchers who experience marginalization in some way, we cannot make definitive claims about to what extent. I'm hopeful that future research takes these tensions and runs with them, challenges them, unpacks them for different contexts. And I'm hopeful that people find these tensions are insufficient even, and in need of reshaping when it comes to different contexts. But my hope is that these four provide a good jumping off point for future inquiry. So where do we go from here? Now, you might be expecting that I end on a list of best practices of what exactly you should do to ensure ethical research. But the overarching theme of our participants' experiences is that there's no one perfect way to go about doing this work. We intentionally avoided prescribing an exact checklist for doing research the right way. We do leave you with the considerations of the participants in our study, but note that accomplishing all of them is not an automatic fail-safe for ethical research. Instead, we hope you will consider the situational needs of the project, potential participants, and others affected by the work, including the research team. In closing, we hope to highlight what makes engaging with marginalized people in research difficult, but also it is important to not let these complexities prevent good research from being done. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm excited for any questions you might have. Oh, how do I? Oh.